Well, let's go ahead and get started with today's devotion. Some of our regulars haven't logged in yet, but we'll go ahead and get started. And we're looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42. And let me read those for you, and then we'll talk about them. And this is one of those passages that are really challenging. So stick with me here as we do this one. Matthew 5, 38 through 42. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you, take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them too. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Well, once again, it starts off with Jesus taking an excerpt from either the law or the moral teaching of the rabbis of Jesus' day. And this does come right out of the Mosaic law. However, the way it comes out of the Mosaic law is different than the way the rabbis were using it at the time of Jesus. You need to remember that the Mosaic law kind of has two types of law in it. Some of it is moral law, the kind of moral law that you're supposed to follow in your everyday personal life. And some of it was civil law. That is the kind of law that the government or the community, the town, or the village should enforce on people. Moral law says this is how you should live, and civil law says this is how you should live, or the community will punish you. For example, the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, that mainly starts off as moral law. That's how you should live. And then in Exodus 21 through 23, these are Old Testament. This is the Jewish law. Contains a lot of ordinances which say, okay, we know this is the moral law, the 10 Commandments, but how do we live this out in our civil law? And so it would take those general principles of the 10 Commandments and say, this is how it works out in everyday life. This is the penalty for doing this damage to a person or this damage to their property. So what happens is that, and that's where that saying is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot comes in. It comes in the civil law. It's not part of the moral law, how we're supposed to live in terms of our interaction with other people. It's how the community is supposed to impose law on people. So it's not telling you as a person, if someone does something to you, you're supposed to go back and do it to them. It's saying this is the standard the community will use in order to punish those that break the law. And this has official Latin terminology for us. It's called the lex talionis, which basically is kind of the retaliation or the punishment for a crime should fit the crime, and it should be to the same degree as the crime. And it's basically saying there should be an exact retribution as much as possible in the criminal code for people who do things that are wrong. And we might think, well, that's kind of harsh, but actually that's an advance for the way laws were practiced back then. Back then, if you were somebody powerful and you were offended a little bit, then the person offended you could be killed, even though you weren't killed. And if you were a person of meager means, kind of low in the social status poll, and something was done to you, something bad, you had almost no recourse. So in a sense, it was an advance because it meant that when somebody did a crime, you didn't overly punish them. Also, it meant that when someone who was powerful did a crime, you didn't ignore them. Whoever the person was, they would be penalized in proportion to what they did. And what it also was really to support to end was like vengeance and family feuds and personal revenge. It was saying, no, we'll let the community decide, let the community evaluate the situation and figure out what the appropriate punishment is. Because if the individual does it, they will almost always want to exact a bigger penalty on the person who offended them or hurt them than what would be appropriate. So it was an improvement. Now, to be honest with you, by the time of Jesus, they didn't quite follow this all the way. They kind of started imposing legal penalties or money penalties for damages. So they didn't always do the physical aspect, but there was still that kind of concept there that you tried to make the punishment equal to the crime and not allow personal vengeance. However, that was the way the code was. But the scribes and the Pharisees were kind of saying, okay, you also do this in the personal realm. You can get revenge on people because after all, the law says eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So you can do it to other people. And that was in direct contradiction to what the Old Testament law says. It says, do not seek revenge. Don't bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. And we a lot of times pull out of the Old Testament that phrase, love your neighbor as yourself. But notice it was given in the context of somebody might be seeking revenge, or somebody might want to carry a grudge against somebody, and so they would do something to them. So what's going on here is Jesus is not overturning the concept that there should be courts in which people are punished. What Jesus is saying is, in your personal life, do not think what the court can do is what you can do. He's not contradicting the principle of retribution for the legal system. He's contradicting it for the individual system. In fact, Jesus kind of upholds that in the legal system. Remember, Jesus says, judge not so you won't be judged. He's saying, do that, don't do that, because if you know what the real penalty is for judging, is that you will be judged right back. And think about it, a lot of Jesus's teaching is about God's judgment on people for violating God's moral command. So Jesus is not throwing out the concept of judgment. What he's throwing out is that people should not take it upon themselves to do that. People don't have the wisdom. People don't have the insight. They don't see the whole picture. We're biased by our own perception. How we should interact with people is love. And so our duty is not to do retaliation, not to get vengeance, not to resist the evil person. I didn't put the passage up there. There it is. There. I guess I didn't even read that, did I? Or maybe I did at the beginning. But notice verse 39. What I tell you, do not resist the evil person. Now, what's going on here? Because we kind of read that and we kind of think, what's going on here? Well, we need to realize here that Jesus, when he starts giving all these specific details, is simply illustrating a general principle. And the general principle is, do not take revenge. Do not take revenge. The general principle is always respond to people out of a desire to express love. Now, this is not a wishy kind of, oh, aren't you wonderful? This is basically the Christian virtue, which says you should always treat people in a way that's best for them. Treat them the best way for them. And he gives us some illustrations here. So let me read those last few verses again, verse 39. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow you. Now, revenge comes easy to the human race. That's our natural tendency to retaliate when someone harms us, to as soon as we're punched, to punch back. But notice Jesus tells us not to hit back. He tells us to go the second mile, even when our enemies are wanting us to do a task. He's basically saying there's a different approach to grievances when somebody sues you. And he's basically saying that we should also be willing to share and be generous with all those things. Jesus, of course, is dealing in general principles. He is not setting down a new law here. And that's very important, because people will look at this and turn this into a new law. And if we're careful in doing so, even though it may be well-intended, we will miss the point. You know, someone says, if someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn them the left cheek. Well, after they turn the left cheek, you go ahead and punch them, right? No, that's not what he's saying. Or someone says, well, no, they slapped me on the left cheek, so I don't have to turn the other cheek. That's what Jesus is saying here. He's saying that we need to respond not out of vengeance and anger and hostility, but respond compassionately with mercy and forgiveness. Not always asserting our rights, but looking at what is the best thing in any given situation. When he says don't resist the evil person, he's not saying that our community should not enforce laws, because then the community evil would triumph over the community. Now, this is about personal interactions. And even when it comes to personal actions, we're going to see that sometimes the loving thing might not be to turn the other cheek. The right thing might be to do that. It really depends on the context. That's why we have to know what the general principle is and see about how we are to respond to it. But Jesus does give us some guidelines, and that's the examples there. And he first starts off with the one about if anyone slaps you on the right cheek. Well, what was a slap on the right cheek? Well, a slap on the right cheek then was an insult. Notice it was a slap, not a punch. And what is a slap? A slap is an insult. And Jesus is basically saying you don't return insult for insult, or necessarily even blow for blow. You need to be ready to endure a little bit of insult and a little bit of of violence toward your body without all of a sudden wanting to get into a big fight. And this was different than the Mosaic laws of the Jews. Basically, their law was if somebody punches you, he's going to pay a fine. And they had a whole list of the fines that somebody had to pay based on exactly how they punched you. For a slap, there was something. For a push, there was something back. For a kick, there was another fine. Jesus is saying that we live an entirely different way in my kingdom. We don't do that. We don't go fighting one person for one person. We avoid fights if all possible, and we try to avoid violence when we can. And in the end, it really takes the stronger person to say, no, I'm not going to get in this petty fight. You know, I'm confident in who I am. If somebody insults me, I don't have to get even for that person. You know, the purpose is never to get revenge. Now, let's face it, you know, Jesus protested injustice that was done to him when he was taken before the high priest. He didn't just say there, he didn't fight back, but he didn't just say whatever they said go. When he was challenged, he answered them, and he wanted to know why they thought they had the right to do that. But in the end, Jesus is here talking about not letting somebody's insult to you cause you all of a sudden to punch them back, insult them back, or get into a petty fight. The next illustration Jesus has is about if someone wants to sue you. And the situation here is not robbery. I know, sometimes the translations kind of get the idea it's just somebody demanding something from you, meeting you on the street. But it's really talking about a legal situation and when somebody is out to get you. And the enemy is rather here adopting legal ways of going after part of Jesus, of a clothing of a follower of Jesus. Now we need to think a little bit about how a person back then would be dressed. A man would have a loincloth, and that would be more the underwear. And then there would be the tunic. That would be kind of like our shirt and our pants. And out that they would have a cloak, which would be an outer garment. Then they would have what's called a girdle. And it's not like what we think of a girdle. The girdle was that kind of wide piece of cloth that they would tie around your cloak so it was gathered together, tight and not flowing. Then somebody would wear a head covering of some time and sandals. So Jesus is envisioning a situation here where someone took a legal measure towards someone to deprive them of that tunic, that outer bit of garment. And that's what it means. It means to take possession of that through legal procedures. And Jesus is saying, don't fight back. Just give them the inner garment as well. The outer one was more expensive. So if they're entitled to that, you might as well give them the inner one as well. And Jesus is saying, do this voluntarily. The next one is the idea of service or requisition. And here the idea of anyone forcing you to go 1 mile and going 2 is actually a reference to what the Romans might require of you. When you were occupied by another country, soldiers could commandeer civilian labor and make people do things, make them carry their backpacks for them or carry supplies. They could be forced to do all kinds of service type tasks. And what's going on here is Jesus saying, hey, if the Romans say that you have to carry this for them 1 mile, carry it for them 2. The Roman mile was 1,000 paces. And so he's saying if they make you go 1,000 paces, go 2,000 paces. And he basically says you just drop what you're doing. And under their authority, you would go 1 mile, but you should show your willingness to go another mile. Now, 2 points of importance here. Jesus is saying not only go beyond what's required, he's also implying we should do this cheerfully. And that can also drive people crazy. When they're forcing you to do something you don't want to do or insulting you, you respond back cheerfully and eagerly. It just kind of undercuts them because a lot of time what they're really wanting to do is to get a response from you of anger and hostility. They want to kind of get you. But by doing what they say and doing it with cheerfulness, you kind of take away from them what they want. And you kind of, in a sense, you kind of beat them in the whole game. Well, then the last thing, the illustration Jesus gives here is to give the one who asks and do not turn away from the one who begs you. And again, Jesus is looking here for generosity. And, to some degree, it's unqualified. He says, give to anyone who asks, deserving or undeserving, and be willing to share and to be borrowing to people. But I think, this is one of those places where we realize that Jesus' situation is different from our situation. Poverty was rampant back then. People were poor. And so it would be uncommon for somebody to come and ask who had a genuine need for food or a genuine need for something. And so Jesus is encouraging us to be generous. Now, when we talk about this and think about this, who exemplified this attitude more than anyone else? Well, Jesus did. Jesus didn't tell us to do something he wasn't willing to do. Later on, when Peter writes, he'll talk about Christ suffering for us and leaving us an example to follow, that he was reviled, he was insulted, but he did not revile or insult back. He was suffered, but when he suffered, he didn't threat people. He trusted God to vindicate him, and God did in the end. What's interesting is Spurgeon, a great preacher of, the 19th century, he talked about how we are anvils because evil people will try to do things to get us. They're like hammers, but the anvil in the end is stronger than the hammer because the anvil is able to take the blows of the hammer and still keep going. Now, let's be honest, though, being an anvil and being a doormat is something else. And Jesus' illustrations are examples of the application of the general principle of love and not seeking revenge. It doesn't mean there's no limits to what we do. It doesn't mean that we should give to somebody if what we give them is going to harm them, not help them. It means that we recognize that we have obligations to our community to stand up for justice and what is right in our community. And we have obligations to take care of and practice and take care of our responsibilities for our family as well. The point he's really wanting to get at is you do not respond with vengeance. You do not respond with hate. You do not respond with hostility. You respond appropriately. And most of the times appropriately is to turn the other cheek, to give what is asked of you and not to oppose them. Rather than always being on the constant lookout for ways you've been offended so you can attack the other person, or ways that you can use what somebody has done for your personal advantage to gain a benefit over them, you are to look at each of those opportunities to respond in the way that's appropriate and the way that is loving. True love will care for the individual who's treating you badly, and true love will care for the society. You know, to follow Christ's commands means we follow them out of a motivation, out of love, and that does not mean that we are foolish. It does not mean that we should irresponsibly respond to somebody's evil behavior, because irresponsibly responding only encourages them to remain a bad person, encourages them to hurt other people, and doesn't help them to change. And so the authentic Christian response is to not be a person of vengeance, to not look for every opportunity to get even with somebody who does something wrong to you, but to respond with mercy and compassion, to respond with love, to have wisdom to respond the right way, but also in the end saying that I will be mistreated at times. I will be abused at times. And specifically, Jesus is talking about when that happens because you're a follower of Jesus. But I will not respond with hostility, with hatred or violence. I will leave it up to God to vindicate me at the right time. And, this really becomes a principle because the Bible is not going to give us every exact situation in which we live. And so we're going to say, well, I don't know, what do I do about it here? There's nothing in the Bible about it. Well, there usually is something in the Bible about it, but it's at the principle level, not at the specific level. And, I'm reflecting, on something that happened to me recently. And I think a few people kind of questioned how I responded, thinking that it was not the response. And, I had to think, why did I respond the way I did? Well, I think it's because these principles have kind of been ingrained in me. So I don't need an exact verse to tell me how to respond in every situation. I've got a principle here. I've got an example of Jesus. I've got encouragements here, not to seek revenge, not to get even, to treat people better than they deserve, going the 2 miles rather than just the 1 mile. And we do that because Jesus treats us better than we would deserve. Jesus gives us more than we should be entitled to. Jesus doesn't treat us with vengeance. He doesn't get even every time we fall short. He doesn't get even every time we don't treat him as he deserves. He's filled with compassion, grace, and mercy, and therefore we should be like that too. But there are times that Jesus says enough is enough, and therefore he chastises us, he disciplines us. And so there will be times when we say, no, what you asked for is not good for you and not good for others, so we'll turn it down. I don't feel that I have to give to everybody who approaches me on the street because I'm not confident everybody who approaches me on the street is going to do the right thing with it. If somebody purely has a need, then certainly. And to be honest with you, I probably give to more people than I should because more people than I don't always know that they're going to do it. But I'm not called to not be discerning because not being discerning is not loving. But I am called to be generous. I'm called to not seek vengeance. I'm called to be merciful and leave it up to God, the outcome from my life and what will happen. So let me encourage you to do what Jesus says today as you live your life. And when you do that, you know what's going to happen? your light's going to shine. Your good deeds will be done, and people will be attracted to Jesus because you live like Jesus, act like Jesus, and talk like Jesus. Let's pray. Father, it is challenging to live the life that you want. It's challenging because we're fallen human beings. We're struggling for our own sense of worth and value. And so when people insult us, it hurts. But Father, help us always to derive our sense of worth and value from the fact that we are your child, that we are loved by you, and no foolish person, what they say, can touch the fact of who we really are. They're just expressing the fact that they are uninformed and ignorant, because if they knew who we were, created by you, in your image, loved by you, bought by the blood of Jesus Christ, they would not say and do what they do. So help us to continue to cling to your evaluation of us, your love for us, your belief in us, and not be bothered by the foolishness of people. Father, help us always to trust you, to let you be the one who vindicates us, to let you be the one who makes things right, because we know you will do it perfectly and accurately. You'll do it at the right time and the right way. Help us have extreme confidence in you, even when sometimes it seems like we are suffering because of our response, that we are being disadvantaged because of our response. Help us to know that you will make up for that, that as people who serve you, that we will not only be blessed, we'll be blessed in greater proportion than what we deserve, because you're kind and generous. So, Father, as we start this day, help us to have your attitude. Help us not to be people of vengeance, but people of love, people who let your light shine through us into the world we live in, into the people around us. We pray this in Jesus' name.